Hey, you're here. That's already more than enough. I know the internet is full of noise and lights, of people shouting opinions and thumbnails screaming for your attention, but you found this corner, quiet. Still. Thank you. Take a second to settle in. You don't have to think too hard. Let go of whatever happened before this. Nothing matters right now except this quiet, slow unraveling of history. Before we begin, if you find comfort here, maybe you can tap the like button or subscribe. It helps us keep this space as it is, calm, curious, and undemanding. And I'd really love to know, where are you listening from? What's the time there? Is it late at night or early morning? Is your room lit by a soft lamp, or are you lying in the dark, headphones tucked under a blanket? Let me know in the comments if you want. I read them all. All right. Now breathe in through your nose, slowly, and let it go. Again, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a place for your thoughts to drift, for your breath to soften, for your eyes to feel a little heavier. Tonight, we're going to talk about what SX was really like in the Middle Ages, but not in the way you're thinking. There are no tabloid rumors here, no dramatic reenactments or scandalous scenes, just the quiet, human truth, the kind you wouldn't Google, the kind that only history and patience can whisper. So let's step back. Not just a few years, but centuries. Imagine a world lit only by flame and sun, where time moves by the ringing of bells, not phones. A world where even the air feels heavier with silence. That's where we're going. And we begin, not in a castle or a battlefield, but in a small village. Mud-packed paths, timber-framed homes, the scent of livestock, clay, and fire smoke in the breeze. This is not the romantic Middle Ages of songs and knights. This is real, and in this world, SX was not a fantasy. It was a rhythm of survival, of expectation, of silence. In the home of a thatcher named Tomas, the bed is not private, it is shared. Not just by husband and wife, but often by children, even the elderly. Warmth matters more than boundaries. When night falls and the coals in the hearth dim, people lie close, tangled like roots. Whispers are rare. Conversations about desire rarer still. SX is not a word spoken. It's a duty, a task, a moment taken in the quietest sliver of darkness, when no one stirs, when breath is all that can be heard. For many women, especially, it is not about want. It is about bearing. Bearing the expectations of family, bearing the weight of survival, bearing children. And yet behind closed shutters, in still barns, beneath the trees there are moments. Secret smiles, silent touches, eyes that meet and hold. Because no matter the era, no matter the rules, humans find ways to connect. But not always easily. The church looms large, bigger than kings, bigger than fate. It speaks of SX only as sin unless it is for procreation. Pleasure is suspect. Desire is policed. Confession becomes the only space to admit a want, and even then, it is whispered like a crime. In monasteries, monks struggle in silence. Some beat themselves for their thoughts. Others fast, hoping hunger will dull their cravings. They pray, not just for salvation, but for stillness of the body. And still the body remains. The skin tingles. The thoughts come. In convents, nuns are told they are brides of Christ. But the quiet, empty nights stretch long. They dream, too, not of men, not always, just of touch, of warmth, of being seen. Marriage itself is not about romance, it is transaction. An exchange of land, of alliance, of duty. A woman brings a dowry, a man offers a name. And when the doors close, they are strangers in a bed, expected to create lineage. The idea of choice is rare. Yet even here, under these layers of structure, love blooms, in secret letters, in shared chores. In the way bread is placed carefully beside a bowl, in a stitched sleeve, in a song hummed at dusk. There are taverns in the towns where SX is traded openly. Women called public wives offer themselves not because they are lesser, but because survival demands it. And they too have codes, preferences, sorrows, joys. Behind every encounter is a story, a reason, a past. And not all of them are tragic. Some are defiant, some are tender. Some, surprisingly, are chosen. There are places on the edge of society, herbalist huts, bathhouses, remote farms where the rules bend. Lovers find each other, away from law, away from gaze. In these pockets of breath, SX becomes more than ritual. It becomes shared, spoken, sometimes even cherished. But even in these moments, fear remains. Fear of punishment, of shame, of being cast out. So much of medieval SX is about silence, about what cannot be said, what must be endured. And yet within the silence there is longing, not just for touch, but for understanding, for connection, for the simple right to feel. That's what we'll continue exploring, slowly, quietly. So close your eyes, if they aren't closed already. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the candles that would have lit those nights. Let your thoughts drift like the smoke from a hearth at midnight. You are safe here. The story will wait for you. And next time, we'll go deeper, into the bedrooms of castles, the rules of noble unions, the poetry hidden in margins. But for now, let the stillness settle in your bones. Let sleep find you like a whisper in the dark. I'll see you again soon. There are things you only notice when the room is still. The way fabric folds beside a candle. The way wood creaks even when no one is walking. The way quiet makes old questions resurface, like dust floating in light. Tonight, we go deeper. We leave behind the village and step into the stone walls of nobility. The places you see in movies' high towers, moats, velvet curtains, but without the polish, without the fantasy. Castles were not always warm. The walls were thick, but the wind found its way through anyway. And in those stone rooms, behind heavy doors and guarded glances, SX took on a different shape. Among nobles, it was not just personality, it was political. Marriages were arranged not for companionship, but for advantage. Your partner was not chosen because of chemistry or affection, but because of land, titles, influence. A daughter might be promised before she could walk. A son's future was drawn on parchment years before he understood the weight of it. And so, the first night together, what we would call a wedding night, was often not between lovers, but strangers fulfilling duty. There were rituals, witnesses, even priests present outside the door to ensure that the marriage was sealed. Privacy was rare. And yet, this moment, this beginning of shared life was expected to yield heirs. Pressure, expectation, and the unspoken rules of propriety surrounded the couple like another wall. In some regions, a bride was taught nothing beforehand. SX was not discussed. Her body was her duty, but she did not know what that meant. In others, a maid or elder woman might whisper vague instructions, but often those were wrapped in metaphor or fear. The man, too, was not necessarily more prepared. He might have spent time with public women, but never with someone he was meant to cherish, protect, or respect. And so they fumbled. Quietly, awkwardly, often with fear. But with time, repetition dulled the uncertainty. Some couples grew close. Not all, but some. And in those rare marriages where affection grew through shared gardens, through songs sung near the hearth, through long winters passed beside each other, SX became something else, something chosen, something explored slowly, not because they were free, but because they were patient. In noble households, women were both elevated and restricted. A lady of the court had to be graceful, silent, and fertile. Her body was not hers, it belonged to lineage. But her thoughts? Her journals? Her moments between embroidery and prayer? Those were hers, and some left traces. In letters hidden between pages, in pressed flowers tucked into books, in the way she smiled when a certain knight walked by. Of course, SX outside of marriage was forbidden, but it happened. Behind drapes and stables and gardens, lovers met in coded silence. They left token rings, ribbons, written verses. One woman might send a carved wooden spoon. A man might leave his glove in her chamber. Their bodies spoke what their voices could not. But if discovered, the punishment was severe. For women, especially. They might be sent to a convent, publicly shamed, or worse. Men were more often forgiven, but even they feared the church's judgment. Confession became a space of inner turmoil, a place where one might admit to thoughts, to dreams, even to touches not acted upon. Priests themselves battled temptations. Some failed. Some sought penance through cold baths, fasts, or isolation, but others, they too longed for softness, for warmth, for another heartbeat near theirs. In this world, education on SX was rare. Most knowledge came from observation, rumor, or experience. Medical texts spoke of humors and fluids, but little of pleasure or understanding. Women's bodies were mysterious, even feared. Some believed a woman must climax to conceive. Others thought desire was dangerous. One text claimed that a passionate woman could steal the soul of a man. So SX became a space of myth, fear, and speculation. And yet, in poetry especially, the courtly, kinda different image emerged. There, love was idealized. A nobleman would devote himself to a woman he could not have usually married. He would write songs, perform brave acts, and worship her from afar. The SX in these poems was never physical. It was emotional, spiritual, almost painful. But even there, the longing was unmistakable. Not for possession, but for connection, for acknowledgement, for being seen. And that, perhaps, was the thread running through all of medieval SX, not the act itself, but the hunger to be known, to be safe, to be wanted, even quietly. And so, in candlelit rooms, in stolen letters, in whispered prayers, people carried their longing, carefully, secretly, tenderly. As you lie there now with the world dim and your breath slow, imagine that long corridor of history. Not just facts, but feelings. Not just rules, but resistance. Because even when SX was chained to ritual, people found ways to soften it, to make it theirs, to let it mean something. And maybe, just maybe, that's what history leaves us, not just records, but reminders. That even in the hardest times, connection finds a way. Let that thought rest beside you now. Let it stay while you drift. The night is still long, and the story is far from over. They say silence has a sound. It hums beneath everything, especially in places built for it. Imagine a monastery. Stone corridors. Cold water in wooden basins. The smell of wax and damp earth. Footsteps, measured and few, words spoken only when needed. In such places, SX does not disappear. It hides, it waits. The young novices boys brought in before their voices change no little of the world outside. Their bodies begin to stir long before their minds understand. No one talks about it. There are rules for behavior, for prayer, for the time one must rise and when one must sleep, but none for the restless thoughts that visit at night. Some lash themselves. Some run extra laps around the courtyard. Some press ice to their skin. All try to quiet the thing that cannot be named, because even thinking is dangerous. In confession, they might whisper it. A glance, a dream, a feeling. The priest listens, nods, assigns penance. But what is never spoken, what lives behind every closed door, is that the priest, too, remembers what it felt like to be 17. In convents, the stillness is different. More floral, more inner. The women rise early, tend to herbs, sing in low tones, mend cloth. Their hair is hidden, their desires even more so. They are told they are brides of Christ, that their love must be spiritual, that their bodies are sacred and not to be shared. But the body does not stop. It aches, it wants warmth. A held hand, a shared smile. Not always more, just something. The quietest rebellion is a gaze held too long, or a name repeated in a prayer not meant to include it. These women write poems. Some survive. They speak of roses and thorns, of burning light, of aching stillness. No one calls it SX, but it is. In its softest, most veiled form. Among servants, SX is less ceremonial, more survival. A maid in a noble house may find herself alone with the Lord too often. Some touches are not invited. Some advances are not refused, not because of consent, but because of fear. A dismissal means starvation. A child born from such moments might be hidden, or given away, or raised among other servants with no name spoken. And yet, even here, not all was sorrow. Sometimes, two stable hands shared a cot and laughter. Sometimes, a kitchen girl and a messenger met at dusk by the well, whispering words neither had learned in books. For them, S3X was not power, it was release. It was stolen minutes that belonged only to them. In towns, women known as midwives, healers, or simply old women held secrets. They knew which herbs could prevent pregnancy, which teas dulled desire, which oils softened pain. They passed this knowledge woman to woman, in corners and courtyards, never writing it down. If the church caught them, they could be accused of witchcraft. But the women kept speaking, they always did. In marketplaces, gossip flowed like water. Who had taken whose glove? Who had lingered too long at a door? Who had been seen barefoot behind a stable? These stories weren't just talk, they were navigation. Social maps of who was safe, who was cruel, who might be kind. S3X, for many, was not private. It was witnessed, interpreted, discussed, and yet never fully understood. No one explained why some women never married and never seemed to mind. No one asked why certain friendships between men lasted decades, closer than brothers. No one questioned why a widow chose to live alone, away from the village, with only her books and her dog. In inns, travelers shared more than stories. Beds were scarce. Bodies pressed together from necessity. And yet sometimes the closeness turned to something more. Fleeting, wordless, forgotten by morning, or never forgotten. Among knights and squires, S3X was woven into the fabric of mentorship and camaraderie. A touch might be dismissed as training, a look as discipline. But behind closed tents, things were not always chaste. Loyalty and affection blurred into something deeper. The church disapproved, but the battlefield made its own rules. And grief, especially, broke all boundaries. When you lose a brother in arms, what you seek is not Logisit's warmth, and the night never judges. S3X in the Middle Ages was not one thing. It was layered, contradictory, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind. It existed between the lines of sermons, between the bricks of castles, in the space between chores and prayer. It was everywhere and nowhere, controlled but never contained. And the people so often left out of official records carried it with them, in their silences, in their longings, in the way they looked at someone, then looked away. Tonight, as you breathe slowly and your thoughts drift towards sleep, remember this. History is not just what was written, but what was felt. The truths whispered in candlelight. The fears confessed to the wind. The hopes stitched into linens or buried in gardens. S3X was never just about the act. It was about presence. Vulnerability. A moment when someone was no longer alone. Let that be the last thought you carry into sleep. That even in a world colder, stricter, and louder than ours, people still reached for each other. And sometimes, they found what they were looking for. The further you move from the castle walls, the more the world shifts. The stones give way to packed dirt, the air smells of hay and smoke, and the sounds come not from bells or commands, but from animals, tools, and laughter. In the villages, life was hard, but not without rhythm. People woke with the sun, worked with their hands, and carried their stories in their voices. And within this rhythm, S3X had its place not as something spoken of openly, but as something lived, whispered, woven into everything. Children learned about bodies from animals first, from goats birthing in the stable, from pigs mounting one another in spring. There were no textbooks, no tutors. Curiosity bloomed early, but explanations came slowly. Parents did not sit children down for talks. Instead, they passed along knowledge through glances, warnings, and sometimes folk songs. Songs that spoke of love and betrayal, of girls who danced with boys too late at night, of men who left and never returned. These weren't lessons, they were memories, and children listened. In these communities, SX was not seen through the lens of morality or sin in the same way it was in the court or the church. It was functional. It led to babies. It bonded couples. It sometimes ruined reputations. But above all, it was natural. The village healer, often an older woman with more herbs than teeth, knew which plants could delay a child or soften a womb. She'd speak in code, hand a satchel tied with twine, and say nothing more. Young girls came to her nervous, unsure, hopeful. She never judged. She had once been them. The boys, meanwhile, learned from older brothers, from stories shared around fires, from moments stolen behind barns. There was boasting. There was shame. There were secrets. Many secrets. Weddings were simple, often arranged but sometimes chosen. A dance at a harvest festival, a shared loaf of bread, a smile held just too long. Love grew in silence. Not always, but sometimes. And when it did, it left mark-etched initials on trees, a ribbon tied around a wrist, a carved spoon given in secret. These tokens were small, but they mattered. They said, "I see you, I want you," even when I cannot say it aloud. SX on the wedding night was often clumsy. Two people who knew each other's faces but not each other's skin. There was no guide, no priest hovering behind the door. Just the creak of the bed, the flicker of the fire, the awkwardness of first contact. And yet, for many, it was sacred not in the church's way, but in the human way. The first child was cause for celebration. Neighbors brought gift spread, wool, chickens, but also questions. Was it born too soon? Was the couple too eager before vows were said? Gossip moved faster than any cart. And reputations, especially for women, could be torn down with a glance. Unwed mothers were not uncommon. Some were pitied, some were shunned. The father's name might be whispered, denied, or forgotten. But the child grew anyway, and the mother endured. Some men stood by them, some didn't. And still, life went on. In these villages, SX was also tied to superstition. A woman might place a charm under her pillow to dream of her future husband. A man might carry a coin blessed by a midwife to increase his virility. During certain moons, couples were warned not to lie together, lest their child be cursed. If a baby was born with a mark or deformity, people would say it was because the parents broke a roulette together during a thunderstorm, or near a church, or too soon after a funeral. These beliefs, odd to us, made perfect sense then. They offered control in a world full of chaos. SX was also in festivals, Beltane fires, spring rites, maypole dances. The air thick with smoke and flirtation, girls with flowers in their hair. Boys with red cheeks, touches hidden behind tents, kisses that meant nothing, or everything. It was fleeting, but that was the point. Life was short, and the body, when not sore from labor, still wanted joy, still wanted closeness, still wanted to feel like more than a tool. In winter, when snow muffled the world, lovers found each other by firelight, blankets shared, stories told, breaths visible in the cold air. A different kind of warmth bloomed then, not from passion, but from presence. To lie beside someone and not be alone, that was enough. SX was not perfect. It was not always kind. There were betrayals, confessions, bruises that couldn't be explained. But there were also moments of tenderness so small they vanished by morning and yet stayed inside the memory like a splinter of joy. And the church, always present, tried to guide it. There were rules. No SX on Sundays, no SX during Lent, no SX during pregnancy or after childbirth or before communion. The list grew longer than any prayer, but people still lived, still loved, still made mistakes, still forgave. Because in the end, the village was not a place of purity. It was a place of people. Messy, earnest, longing people. And their SX lives were not evil or holy. They were just human. As you lie there now, listening to the hush of your own breath, think of those who came before, who held hands in barns, who shared apples and glances, who kissed under trees without knowing if they'd marry, if they'd be caught, if they'd regret it. Think of them not as strangers, but as reflections. Because their world, though harder, was filled with the same longings, the same quiet hopes, the same desire to be seen, to be touched, to be loved, even if only once. Let that softness stay with you as the night deepens. And know that every heartbeat, now and then, wants the same thing: to not be alone. In the hush of night, when the fires burn low and the wind rustles the straw thatch above, villagers lie awake, not just from cold, but from thought. They stare at the wooden beams of the ceiling, tracing patterns in the dark, listening to the soft breaths of the person beside them, or the emptiness of a bed long untouched. In these quiet moments, SX becomes not a deed, but a question, a hope, a weight. Among the peasants, SX was never just about bodies. It was a language without words, a signal in a glance, a spell cast with a touch. And like all powerful things, it was surrounded by superstition. They believed that a dream could reveal the soul of another. If you dreamt of someone holding your hand, it meant they had already thought of you in waking life. If you dreamt of dancing, it was a sign your heart longed for union. But if you dreamt of fire, especially around the feet or thighs, it meant desire dangerous, unspoken, sometimes forbidden. Dreams were warnings, messages, omens. Women shared them in hushed tones as they washed clothes by the river. Men discussed them in the field between work and bread. No one claimed to understand them fully, but everyone listened. There were charms too. Ribbons dipped in rainwater, left under pillows. Hair wrapped in linen and hidden in shoes. Whispers said 3 times before dawn. These were not just folk games, they were armor. In a world where choice was limited and power imbalanced, magic became a way to feel in control. The old women who knew the herbs and the signsum called them witches, some called them wise. They would mix a tea to cool the blood, or give a potion to increase warmth. They said the moon governed the body, that certain tides pulled more than the sea. A full moon might make a man restless, a woman open to dreams. A dark moon warned of betrayal. All of this lived alongside the church, not in opposition but in shadow. For every sermon about sin, there was a whisper about balance. For every rule about chastity, a tale about love too strong to be denied. People lived between these lines. They married who they were told to marry, but sometimes loved in secret. They bore children they never planned, and sometimes never bore at all. Infertility was not understood, but it was feared. A woman who did not conceive was pitied, then suspected. Was she cursed? Was her womb cold? Did she lie with another man before marriage and ruin her chance? Men too were judged. A husband who did not produce heirs was mocked quietly. They would say he had weak seed, or that he angered God. Remedies were sought. Roots boiled in wine, baths with special salts, prayers spoken backwards. And sometimes nothing worked. So they blamed the stars. They blamed each other. They blamed fate. In festivals, the veil between rule and release grew thin. At harvest, wine flowed. At solstice, fires burned high. Masks were worn. Identities blurred. Young people danced until their legs gave out. Some vanished into fields together. They returned at dawn with grass in their hair and secrets in their smiles. No one asked. Everyone knew. And the next day, the world resumed. Chores, silence, duty. But something always lingered. SX was power, but not in the way lords held power. It was subtler. A girl who smiled the right way could shift a boy's entire day. A man who touched a wrist too long might change the course of a wedding. These were not grand moves, they were flickers. But in a small world, flickers mattered. And so rules emerged. Mothers told daughters not to wear red on Fridays. Boys were warned never to lie under a tree where someone had hanged themselves. It would make their children cursed. A woman who bathed at night risked drawing spirits. A man who touched himself too often was said to lose his strength. These weren't just beliefs. They were boundaries. And within them, people lived. Some obeyed, some didn't. And all bore the consequences. The confessional box became a place where the forbidden was spoken, whispers filtered through wood, a stolen moment, a heavy breath, a thought that wouldn't leave. The priest would murmur prayers, assign penance, and sometimes look away. He had heard it before, he would hear it again. And yet, for all the fear, all the warning, SX still found a way. Two hands still met in haylofts, two hearts still pounded at the same time. And when they did, it felt like something more than chance. It felt like truth. As you lie still now, your own thoughts drifting in the dark, know that you are not alone in your wondering. The villagers before you also stared at ceilings. They too wondered if desire was wrong or simply human. They whispered their dreams to the wind and hoped someone would hear. Let your breath slow, let your mind soften. And as you fall into sleep, imagine a candle flickering in a clay window, a room full of silence and breath, a world where nothing was explained, but everything was felt. In every village there were stories that went unspoken, not because they were forgotten, but because remembering them out loud felt dangerous. In the silence between chores, in the space between glances, people knew. They knew about the girl who disappeared after being caught in the hayloft with the blacksmith's son. They knew about the widow who gave birth long after her husband had died. They knew what it meant when a man returned from the forest with blood on his hands and eyes too quiet. But they did not speak. Not to each other, not to the priest, not even to God. Because in these stories, SX was not soft or warm, it was sharp, tangled in fear and control. The church taught that desire was a test, that the body was a vessel for sin. Priests preached that to resist was holy, and to indulge was to step toward hell. And yet, people were human. They wanted, they reached, they made mistakes, and the punishment, when it came, was not always just. A woman accused of SX outside marriage might be made to stand in the village square, hair shorn, clothes torn. Children threw stones. Old women turned away. Men stared. Her shame was made public, carved into memory. A man, if accused, might pay a fine or say a prayer, sometimes nothing at all. Other times, if the act crossed a certain line, if it involved another man or someone too young or someone unwilling, the punishment was worse. Stocks, whippings, branding, banishment, death. And yet, behind these brutal edges, people still lived their truths. There were women who loved other women, who touched hands behind market stalls, and kissed only when the world slept. There were men who never married, who claimed they were devoted to their work, but whose eyes followed the same face every Sunday. There were couples who defied the rules, who loved deeply but never wed, who raised children in silence, pretending their union was a mistake, a sin, something less than real. But it was real. It always was. The rules said otherwise, but the heart never listened. And so people created spaces between the rules. They married late. They took in orphans who looked like someone's son. They adopted titles like cousin, helper, servant, anything to stay close, anything to stay hidden. And sometimes they were found. A neighbor grew suspicious. A priest asked too many questions. A child spoke without knowing the cost. And when that happened, the world collapsed. Confessions forced. Friendships ended. Lovers separated by force, by shame, by silence. But not always. Some found a way to go on, to rebuild under new names, to move to another village, to pretend, or simply to endure. The human spirit, even crushed, finds cracks in the stone. SX in these moments was not about pleasure. It was about recognition, to be seen, to be known, to be held, even once, even briefly. That was enough. And still, in all this darkness, there were pockets of light. A midwife who kept a secret, a brother who helped a sister escape, a priest who looked the other way. Not all were cruel. Some understood. They too had longings. They too had broken rules in the quiet of their own hearts. And in that shared frailty, there was compassion. There were also stories in the woods, of women who lived alone in cottages, who took no husband, who grew herbs and healed wounds. Some feared them, called them witches, but others came to them, in secret, for help. for a remedy, for a prayer, for permission to feel. These women knew more than most. They had seen it all. They understood that SX was not sin. It was survival, in a world built on labor and obedience. It was the one place where people could reclaim themselves, even if briefly, even if it hurt, even if it left a scar. And so they offered their wisdom in whispers, told girls how to protect themselves, told boys how to be kind, told lovers how to listen. They were not saints. They were not devils. They were human, like everyone else. And through them, the old knowledge lived on, passed hand to hand, story to story, never written, always remembered. Tonight, as you listen to this, perhaps you feel something in your chest, a tightness, a tenderness, a question. That's normal. The world they lived in was harsh, but in that harshness, they found ways to soften. A touch under a table, a note tucked into bread, a song sung just for one. These things mattered. They still do. As your breath slows, as your eyes grow heavy, think of them not as figures in a history book, but as echoes. People who longed, who feared, who broke rules, who loved anyway. Let their courage soothe you. Let their stories keep you warm. And know that in every era, every century, every village or city, SX was not just an act. It was a question we kept asking with our bodies. Am I seen? Am I safe? Am I loved? And sometimes in the quietest moments, the answer came back, not in words, but in presence, in breath, in silence, in sleep. The road was not straight. It bent with the shape of rivers, hills, and the unspoken paths of those who walked before. Travelers came and went, with calloused feet and dust on their cloaks, their voices low and their eyes scanning the horizon. Along these roads, SX changed. It did not belong to rules or homes. It drifted like smoke from a distant fire, shaped by need, loneliness, or the chance to be someone else for a night. Pilgrims walked for penance. Some walked for escape. But all of them carried stories beneath their silence. They gathered at crossroads, drank from the same wells, knelt in the same chapels. In these spaces, glances lingered longer than prayers. Shared food turned into shared warmth. Sometimes it was nothing more than a look by candlelight. Sometimes it became a body pressed against another behind a hedge, or in the shadows of a wayside inn. Taverns welcomed them all. By day, they were loud and full of barter. By night, they softened. The fire crackled, wine spilled easily. Songs echoed off low wooden beams. A girl with dark eyes and worn shoes passed cups from hand to hand. A boy with nimble fingers tuned a lute. And in between verses, moments were exchanged. SX in these spaces was not planned. It was stumbled upon. A tired smile. A bed shared out of necessity. Two strangers pretending not to be strangers, and sometimes pretending worked. For a few hours, the past could vanish. The rules of the village or the monastery could fade. In a different town, under a different name, a person could be bold or gentle or just seen, but not always. The road had its dangers. A man might promise affection, but leave bruises. A woman might speak sweetly and vanish with your coin. Disease traveled too, whispered from mouth to mouth, unspoken but known. There were herbs to help, if you knew where to find them. Some wore charms wolf teeth on a cord, rings inscribed with Latin no one could read. Protection against more than spirits. There were others who lived on the road. Performers, jugglers, puppeteers. They brought laughter where days were long, and among them, the lines between role and self blurred. The woman who played a queen might sleep in a wagon. The man who dressed as a fool might be a poet by night. Their SX was part of their act, and also beyond it. Affection was currency. Passion, a gift, or a performance. Sometimes both. The church frowned on them, called them tempters, distractions, sin in motion. But people still came to watch, and some followed the troupe from town to town, drawn by something unnamed. Pilgrimage routes had their own rhythm. Some walked barefoot, others rode. And at night, campsites flickered with firelight. People from distant lands sat side by side. Language barriers dissolved under stars. A hand extended meant the same thing in any tongue. A touch on the knee, a shared blanket, a whispered story with no ending. For some, these encounters were fleeting. For others, they stayed in memory long after the journey ended. Sometimes they were never spoken of again. Sometimes they were the only things spoken of. Stories grew in taverns. A man might claim he lay with a duchess in disguise. A woman might say her lover was a spirit in the woods. Truth twisted with longing. But under the wine and laughter, there was always a seed of something real. S3X in motion was like water. It filled the space it was given. It made people feel alive. It reminded them they were more than labor or prayer, more than regret. There were roadside brothel, S2, small places with red fabric over the door. The women inside knew many things, not just about men, but about grief, hope, pain, hunger. They listened, sometimes more than they touched. They knew when a man wanted to be forgiven, when a woman wanted to forget. When two people wanted to pretend they weren't broken, they rarely asked names. That wasn't the point. The transaction was part of it, but not all of it. There was something sacred in being seen, in being touched gently, in being asked nothing but to exist just for a while. And they paid a price for this gift. Judgment, illness, violence. But many chose it still, because in a world where choices were few, this was theirs. Monks and nuns also traveled, sometimes with a purpose, sometimes because they could no longer stay. Not all were chaste, not all were cruel. Some wrestled with their vows like a coat too tight. Others broke them quietly once and carried the shame for years. There are letters from the time hidden in libraries, smudged with age. A monk writing of a woman's eyes. A nun dreaming of a kiss. They never said the word, but you can read it between the lines. Desire, even cloaked in guilt, still glows. And at night, on the road under the same sky, they too felt its pull. Tonight, as your thoughts drift, imagine that path. A narrow track between trees, a lantern swinging on a pole. The smell of wood smoke, and bread, and sweat. A world that judged harshly, but still allowed softness in hidden corners. A world where S3X was not just about flesh, it was about escape, relief, hope, and a simple wish to be held, if only until morning. They moved at night, most of them. The ones without names. The ones who didn't ask questions or answer them. You could find them behind taverns just after the last lantern was put out, or near the stables, bundled in cloaks, whispering to no one. Their footsteps left no trace, not because they were silent, but because no one bothered to remember them. They were the ones who had seen too much or done too little, who loved someone they weren't supposed to, or left someone who needed them, or simply lost everything. The road gave them no answers, but it gave them movement. And in that movement, there was something like peace, or distraction, or at least delay. S3X for them was not a celebration. It was not intimacy in the candlelight or longing hidden in poetry. It was a way to forget. A way to hold someone so tightly that for 1 minute the noise inside their head went quiet. They didn't always ask. They didn't always speak. They simply arrived. Two people looking away from themselves, finding each other like broken glass finding the floor. There were places that welcomed them. Wayhouses, border towns. Markets on the edge of nowhere. In these places, the rules changed. A woman could wear a man's tunic. A man could braid his hair. No one cared if you were married, or if you prayed, or if your name matched your accent. In those hours, everyone was someone else. And sometimes, that was all they wanted. In the corner of a room filled with noise, two people could meet eyes and know everything. Not names, not stories, just need, just warmth. And the agreement that this would last only until the fire died, or the sky turned gray, or someone started singing again. Among them were women who sold comfort, not always for coin, sometimes for food. Sometimes just because they couldn't sleep alone again. They didn't wear red ribbons or stand at doorways. They moved quietly, spoke softly, learned to disappear the moment after it was done. They weren't lovers. They weren't wives. They were something in between a momentary pause and a lifetime of running. Some of them were men. Most people didn't talk about that. But they existed. And they offered the same forgetfulness, the same silence, the same eyes that didn't look too closely. Travelers sometimes grew attached. They gave tokens, buttons, bits of ribbon, small carvings, but they never stayed. That was the rule. The road was for movement, not for roots. Priests sometimes joined them too. Not all priests were old. Not all were celibate. Some walked the road because they had no choice. Others because they chose it, needing to believe that God lived beyond the chapel walls. They heard confessions under trees. They touched hands they shouldn't have. They blessed strangers and kissed them afterward. They were not evil. They were not saints. They were human, and the road made them more so. The same was true of women who once lived in convents. Some left by force, some by choice. Some just walked away one day and never looked back. They cut their hair, learned to live without bells. They never used the word SX, but they understood it. In the way a body curled in sleep. In the way someone whispered your name in the dark, even if it wasn't your name at all. The road had its own rhythm, its own way of measuring Timonot in hours, but in arrivals. In who you met, who you left behind. Who you tried not to remember. SX on the road was fleeting. It had to be. But that didn't make it meaningless. In fact, sometimes it made it more, because when you have nothing, and someone reaches for you anyway, that moment becomes a kind of salvation, even if it's borrowed, even if it ends. There were rules unwritten but known. Never ask why someone's alone. Never promise more than tonight. Never follow in the morning. And above all, never pretend it didn't happen. Because it did, and that matters, even if no one else saw. Some people broke the rules. They fell in love, real love. Not storybook, not holy, not practical. Just two people who found in each other something solid. They left the road together, tried to build something from scraps. A room, a stall in a market, a home. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but they tried. And in a world that punished trying, that was enough. There were also those who lived on the edge of towns, near the woods. Hermits, some called them, sinners, witches, but they knew things. How to keep warm without fire. How to make a broth from weeds. How to touch without bruising. People came to them in secret, not for spells, but for knowledge. How to survive, how to feel, how to be close without being caught. These hidden ones, they rarely spoke. But when they did, their words lingered, like moss on stone, like breath in cold air. The road never ended, not really. Even when it led back to a home, or to death, or to a place that felt safe, it remained inside, a rhythm in the bones, a memory under the skin. And those who walked it carried more than their burdens. They carried every hand held, every night shared, every time they were more than forgotten. Tonight, as you lie still, think of them, the ones who never stayed, who didn't belong, who found, in the act of reaching for someone, not just SX, but something gentler, something wordless, something holy in its own quiet way. There were places not marked on any map, places that existed only between dusk and dawn, known only to those who had nothing to return to. These were the fields just outside the village where fires flickered low, the ruins with moss-covered stone where voices echoed only if you whispered, the back corners of roadside churches where no one prayed anymore. These were the spaces claimed by the forgotten, the in-between, the ones who moved without leaving footprints. They didn't ask for much. A piece of bread, a dry place to lie down, a face that didn't flinch. Sometimes, what they asked for most was a moment of being seen. SX in these places was not seduction. It was not ritual. It was not performance. It was the answer to silence. The hand that reached out because it was too cold not to. The lips that moved because words had stopped working. It was clumsy, imperfect, and often it hurt. But in that pain, was something almost honest, a confession not spoken, but lived. There were men who hadn't heard their names said kindly in years. There were women who had been touched only in anger, and when they found someone who paused before laying a hand on them, who asked with their eyes instead of their fists, that moment became more than physical. It became a kind of salvation. The church would have called it sin. The town would have called it shame. But for them, it was something else entirely. It was the moment the body remembered it was still alive, that it could feel, that it deserved to. Some wore tokens, a bit of cloth from someone long gone, a stone carved with a shape they couldn't explain. They carried these in secret, tied around ankles, hidden in bags, sewn into the seams of their cloaks. They weren't charms, they were anchors, reminders of nights when they mattered, when someone breathed against their skin without demand, when they laughed, really laughed for the first time in seasons. Others never spoke of it. They carried it in the way they walked, a little lighter, a little straighter, as if one night someone had convinced them they weren't broken beyond repair. These stories didn't end in weddings. They didn't lead to homes or babies or names in church records. They ended quietly. One person continuing down the road, another waking to an empty blanket. But the story didn't die. It stayed in the chest, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the way a hand curled inward at rest, remembering the echo of another. There were dangers too, always. Not everyone who smiled meant warmth. Some took, some hurt, some pretended to offer healing but left scars instead. But they were the exception. Most of them, these wandering souls, they knew too well what pain was. They would not add to it. S3X for them was not about conquering. It was about sharing, about softening, about giving without taking too much. Sometimes they used no words at all, just gestures. A space made on the ground, a blanket shared without being asked, a glance that said, "You're safe for now," and that was enough. In a world where so much was uncertain, where even the sky could change its mind, that small certainty became sacred. There were also songs, low, slow songs sung under breath. Songs that spoke of lovers lost and nights too short. They weren't written down. They passed from one traveler to another, changing slightly with each voice. And in these songs, S3X was not hidden. It was remembered. Not as glory, but as grace. As a kindness too brief to last. As a warmth too fragile to keep. Some sang these songs alone, staring at stars. Others hummed them as they walked, letting the rhythm match their steps. The songs didn't promise anything. They simply told the truth. And sometimes, that was all anyone wanted. The truth. That they had been held. That someone had whispered their name. That their body, for once, had been more than a burden. Tonight, as you listen, maybe you understand this too. That S3X is not always about pleasure. That sometimes it's about proof. Proof that you're not invisible, that your skin can still feel, that someone can reach for you without flinching. In the Middle Ages, that proof was hard to come by. Rules were strict, lives were short. But even in that darkness, people found each other. In doorways, in fields, in ruins. Not perfectly, not forever, but long enough. Long enough to breathe again, long enough to be still. Long enough to forget the cold. So close your eyes now. Imagine that moment, the flicker of firelight, the hush of leaves, a breath, not your own, warm on your neck, and no words, just presence, just touch. Just the deep, quiet knowledge that for one night, you are not alone. The city did not sleep, not truly. Even when the bells stopped and the market stalls folded, even when the taverns closed their doors, and the lanterns flickered out one by one, the city breathed. It shifted beneath its stone skin. It whispered through shutters and echoed in narrow alleys. It was in those hours, between midnight and the call to prayer, that S3X changed shape. It became something quieter, something folded in linen and hushed through walls not meant to be heard through. Behind every wooden door, behind every crooked beam, someone reached for someone, not always with love. Not always with desire, but often with need. The city was not kind to need. It measured everything in coin and status. SX was taxed, regulated, punished, and hidden, but it was never gone, never absent. It lived in the way a woman brushed flour from her hands before slipping upstairs, in the way a man paused before lighting the last candle, in the glance across a shared courtyard when someone's husband was away. The church watched. It placed confessional booths like cages and told people to empty their shame into the dark. But shame doesn't burn away so easily. And SX, wrapped in guilt, only grew more tangled. There were brothels sanctioned by the city. They paid their dues, kept records, stayed within designated streets. But even there, nothing was simple. Women were inspected. Men were fined. There were rules about who could touch whom and how, and yet, behind those doors, there were moments fleeting, unexpected of kindness. A girl braiding another's hair after a long night. A man bringing a plum just because she'd once said she missed the taste. These moments didn't make it right, but they made it real. Outside the official walls, SX was messier. It lived in rented corners, in dark stairwells, in the uneven beds of apprentices and laundresses. The baker's boy with flour on his elbows. The blacksmith's daughter who laughed too loudly. The nun who didn't believe in silence. They all carried their own versions of wanting, and the city, loud and watchful, forced them to carry it in secret. Windows became witnesses. Thin wooden floors became accomplices. You could learn a neighbor's rhythm by accident, a sigh through the plaster, a creak at the same hour each week. Some ignored it. Some listened. A few, alone and restless, timed their own breath to match it. There were codes. A cloth tied a certain way to the balcony. A candle left burning in the cellar window. A knock that wasn't quite a knock, for those who couldn't say what they wanted aloud. The city taught them how to speak in signals. SX became a language without words. But even language needs silence, and the city gave little of it. Every act carried risk. Being seen, being named, being brought before the magistrate, or worse, the priest. Some faced lashings. Others were paraded through the streets. Women lost dowries. Men lost apprenticeships. But the city never truly punished everyone. It punished the poor, the queer, the outspoken, the ones who didn't hide well enough, the ones who didn't apologize. Still, people found ways. In bathhouses, in bakeries, between prayers, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in silence. The baker's wife and the brewer's daughter who met only at the well, fingers brushing over buckets. The priest who walked farther each day to see the same tanner's boy at TF, River. The widow who rented her attic not for coin but for company. These stories rarely made it into records, but they lived in memory, passed quietly from mouth to ear. There were also maps not drawn but walked. A certain alley meant safety. A staircase 3 doors past the dye shop meant warmth. A rooftop, hidden from the bell tower's gaze, meant an hour of sky where no one could see. Lovers carved marks in stone, not hearts, but lines. One for every time they returned. Walls bore their stories long after their voices were gone. This city kept secrets better than people thought. Some rooftops knew more about SX than cathedrals. Some stairwells were holier than chapels. In those spaces, people didn't just take from each other. They gave a story, a memory, a reason to come back. And as dawn crept over the slate tiles and iron gutters, the city shifted again. Doors unlocked, bread was baked, children ran. And all the night's softness folded itself away, waiting for dark to return, waiting for the next moment when someone would reach for someone else, not out of lust, but out of longing not to be alone. And in that reach, in that hush, in that breath caught between walls, the city would breathe again. Inside the stone walls of the city, not all SX was hidden. Some of it happened in the open within marriage, under roofs blessed by priests and bound by contracts. But that didn't make it simpler. If anything, it made it heavier. A duty, a schedule, something woven into the linens and carved into the bedposts. For many, it began on the wedding night, often with strangers. Two hands that had never held each other, now told to intertwine. Two bodies made to share a bed just because paper and God said they should. Some were kind, others weren't. For many women, sex was not pleasure but expectation, a thing to endure, a thing to survive. A thing spoken of in hushed tones by mothers before the ceremony, and rarely again. Husbands, too, carried their own weights. They were told to perform, to prove, to control. If the wife conceived, they had done their part. If she didn't, prayers were said, herbs were brewed, suspicions whispered, but no one asked how it felt, whether it meant anything, whether they had even looked at each other. The houses were small, rooms shared, children asleep in corners. Privacy was rare. Some waited for market days when others were out. Some used the cover of thunder or the noise of festivals. Others simply turned their faces away and got on with it. There were rules, too. The church dictated when sex was allowed, never on holy days, never during Lent, never before communion. That left fewer nights than one might think. And so desire, if it existed at all, learned to wait. To bend. To disappear. Some couples found rhythms, shared glances, quiet touches while stirring soup or folding linen. They found joy not in fire but in warmth, not in passion but in presence. A hand on a shoulder, a breath in the dark, a whispered joke before sleep. They carved tenderness from routine, from ritual, from simply staying. But others did not. Beds grew colder, conversations shorter. Sex became something done, not shared, a task, a ticked box, and resentment crept in like mold on damp walls. In these homes, the act became memory, something that had happened once perhaps, but now lay silent beneath the floorboards. Still, not all stories were bleak. There were women who discovered power in their touch, who learned to ask, to teach, to guide, who whispered, not out of shame, but out of intimacy, and men who listened, who watched for the curl of a smile, the softening of breath, who cared more for connection than conquest. These stories didn't travel far. They stayed behind closed doors, but they existed, and sometimes that was enough. Even the walls listened. Thin plaster, crooked beams, they heard it all. The sighs, the silence, the names called in the night, and they remembered. Some said the houses kept those sounds, that they soaked into the wood and lingered, that if you slept in an old bed long enough, you'd dream of people who once held each other there. Not their faces, but their closeness, their wanting, the shape they made beneath the blanket. In kitchens, sex was discussed only in fragments. A raised eyebrow, a dropped spoon, a joke too crude for the priest but not for the baker's wife. Gossip filled the gaps. Who visited whom? Whose windows stayed lit too late? Whose child looked too much like the neighbor? But truth rarely followed gossip. The truth was quieter, more private. It lived in the way someone walked the next morning, in the extra bread baked, in the song hummed without thinking. And it wasn't always about desire. Often it was about comfort, reassurance. A way to say, we are still here, together. Some marriages were arranged by family, some by debt, some by desperation. And yet, over time, something grew. Not love, perhaps, but loyalty. Not excitement, but ease. And in that ease, sex softened. It became something safe, predictable. A rhythm that didn't thrill, but didn't hurt. A part of life like mending clothes or lighting the hearth. Then there were the exceptions. The stolen moments. The glances across church pews. The midwives who lingered too long. The merchants who returned more often than they needed. These weren't always acted upon, but they lived in the imagination, in dreams, in long silences while folding sheets. Sex was not one thing, it was many. It was duty and rebellion, silence and noise, ache and balm. And within the city, behind its orderly walls, it beat quietly, like a second pulse, unseen, unspoken, but there, always there. As you lie still now, maybe you feel it too, that quiet thrum of history beneath you. The breath of all those who came before, who touched and longed and turned away. The weight of 1,000 nights, lived and forgotten, but never really gone. When the last lanterns went out and the final prayers whispered into rafters, the city shifted again. Not everyone slept. Not truly. Some waited, some listened, some walked. The cobblestones cooled beneath their bare feet. Cats curled against chimney stones, and in the silence, the kind only a city knows, SX stirred again. Not with passion, not with noise, but with stillness, with intent, with memory. A widow opened her window just wide enough to breathe in the cold. She didn't expect anyone, but she left a candle anyway. Below, a merchant returning late from a nearby town paused, not because he knew her, but because something in the flicker reminded him he wasn't alone. SX, in these hours, was not about bodies meeting in hunger. It was about proximity, about the space between the breath and the word, about who looked up when the shutters creaked. Some lovers were secret, some were silent, some were never spoken aloud, even to themselves. But they existed, in the glances passed in market stalls, in the exchange of coin not for flesh but for a song, in the act of walking 3 streets out of the way just to pass someone's door. There were men who dressed as women, and women who bound their chests. There were people who didn't have the language for what they felt, but knew it all the same. The city was harsh to those who didn't fit its mold. It punished difference with flame, with rope, with exile, and yet beneath the cover of night truth found a way. Lovers met not with declarations, but with nods, with hands brushing beneath shared cloaks, with hours spent saying nothing and everything. There was a tailor's apprentice who always sang when he worked. His voice lifted through the narrow street, landing on the balcony where a tanner's boy scrubbed hides. They never spoke, but each day the song rose, and each day the boy listened. Years later, he would hum it to his children without knowing why. SX left traces even in silence. Some homes bore witness to unions the law wouldn't name. 2 men who shared a bed for 20 winters. 2 women who raised a child between them, claiming he was a cousin's orphan. Their love was not loud, but it held. Through plagues, through frost, through sermons that said their touch was sin. Still, they touched. And still, the world turned. There were also those who loved no one, not in that way, who found their peace in solitude, who watched the moon move and felt content, who stitched tapestries alone and smiled. Their stories mattered too, because SX was never just about coupling. It was about presence, about knowing yourself in the quiet, about choosing when and how to be near another. The city made that choice hard. It said who could touch, and when, and why. But people are stubborn. They bend rules. They make maps of shadows. They learn where to stand to see and not be seen. Lovers met at the bakery's back door, under the archway near the well, in the alcove behind the chapel, where the saints looked away. The bells would toll, and they would part. But for a moment, they had something that wasn't blessed, but was real. SX in the city wasn't always tender. It could be sharp, transactional, bruised. Not every story is soft. Some took what wasn't offered. Some gave out of fear, not desire. And the city, in its bureaucracy, often looked away. But even in those shadows, even in the pain, people survived. They found each other. They rebuilt. They whispered truths to friends who didn't judge. They carved escape routes with every smile. And sometimes, SX became healing. A touch after grief, a kiss after long silence. A hand in the dark saying, "I'm still here, you're still here. Let's stay a little longer." Children grew into adults carrying questions they dared not ask. And sometimes, someone older answered without words, with a gesture, with kindness, with the absence of judgment. There were books hidden behind bricks, drawings passed in flour sacks, codes carved into tree trunks outside the city walls. Love did not need permission to exist. It only needed breath. And night gave it that. As the city slumbered, stories unfolded. 2 cloaked figures on a rooftop, pointing at stars. A woman lighting a second candle after her husband slept. A boy humming while folding sheets, thinking of someone who laughed like bells. These were SX too. Not loud, not burning, but present. And when morning came, when shutters opened and wheels turned, the city forgot. Or pretended to. But the stones remembered, and so did the walls. And maybe now, as you lie still, they're whispering to you. Not in words. In feelings. In echoes. In the weight of history beneath your pillow. In the hush between heartbeats. In the knowledge that even in the strictest cities, even in the darkest rules, someone always found a way to feel. Far from the echo of cathedral bells and the clatter of city carts, the world slowed. Villages sat cradled in valleys, tucked beneath hills, wrapped in fog and silence. Here, SX didn't wear perfumes or silks. It didn't happen behind doors carved with saints. It was earthy, routine, bound by rhythms older than words. The rooster's call, the harvest moon, the sound of a river just before thaw. Children were born into rooms that smelled of clay and bread. They grew watching animals couple, seeing how the sow lifted her hind legs or how the rooster strutted. No one explained it. Not directly. But lessons arrived all the same. In glances, in warnings, in the sudden silence when a neighbor passed too closely. Girls were told to keep their eyes down, to cover their hair, to sit with knees together and hands folded. Boys were told to work, to lead, to look. But no one said why. Not in a way that could be understood. There were weddings, often arranged, a field for a daughter, a cow for a cousin. 2 hands shaken and the girl sent with a sack of clothes and an old iron pot. She would ride behind a cart or walk a mile. Then she would enter a new house with new people and be called wife. That night she'd share a bed with a man she barely knew. A man who'd been told that SX was his right, his proof, his due. Some were gentle, some were not. Some said nothing, just lifted the blanket and waited. Others prayed first. She might cry, or go still, or imagine herself elsewhere back in the woods, running with her sisters, watching geese on the pond. In the village, everyone knew. Not what happened, but when it had happened. The sheets were hung, the blood was checked. Songs were sung if the signs were right. If not, whispers brewed. Blame fell quickly. She didn't bleed. She wasn't pure. He didn't finish. He was cursed. The pressure weighed like wool in the rain. Still, life moved on. The earth needed tilling. Goats needed milking. Children arrived, sometimes quickly, sometimes not. And with them came more rules, more rhythms. SX became another chore, another ritual, done after supper, before dawn, during feast weeks, or not at all. No one spoke of pleasure, not aloud, not seriously. Laughter came in the form of riddles or songs. Old tunes about farmers and their wives, about the priest's sister and the blacksmith's hammer. But behind the jokes was silence. And behind the silence, longing. Some found comfort, some didn't. Some touched each other with reverence. Others, with resentment. There were moments of kindness. A husband washing his wife's feet after the birth. A wife wrapping her arms around a man who'd lost his brother. These were SX too. Not the act, but the closeness. The choosing. The being seen. Fields offered hiding places. Behind haystacks, in barns, near the edge of the woods. Young lovers met where the air was thick with pollen and promise. They whispered names they didn't dare say in the daylight. Sometimes it ended with marriage, sometimes with exile, a belly grown too round too soon, a confession dragged from trembling lips, the village judged, harshly, girls sent away, boys beaten. But the wind kept blowing, and hearts kept turning. Not everyone fit the mold. There were those who never married, who lived alone and smiled at the sun, who sang to the fire and felt full. Their SX lived in dreams, in stories, in the warmth of their own bodies. There were others who loved differently, who touched hands longer than needed, who watched someone of the same sex and didn't look away. These feelings were dangerous, not just sinful, but strange, something to be feared. But they bloomed anyway, like mushrooms in dark places, like moss on shaded stones. And sometimes, rarely, they were shared. in glances, in shared cups. In a night too cold to sleep apart, the church held sway. It spoke of sin and shame, of confession and penance. Priests warned against desire, but some carried their own. A hand too low during blessing, a visit too long after dusk. Everyone knew someone, a cousin, a neighbor, a man who once kissed another man and never returned. These stories floated like smoke, unseen but heavy. The village never forgot, but it didn't always punish. Sometimes it just turned away, pretended not to see, let things be. Essex in the countryside was like the weather, sometimes harsh, sometimes kind, sometimes sudden, mostly predictable. It followed patterns: marriage, children, silence. It arrived with the planting and left with the frost. But inside that cycle, there were cracks. Moments of rebellion, of reaching, of choosing softness in a world that offered little. And in those cracks, the real stories lived. A touch behind the granary, a kiss stolen during milking, a song hummed while darning socks, thinking of someone else. These were the Essex stories that didn't make it into records, but they mattered because they were human. And humanity, even in the smallest hut, even under the strictest rule, finds a way to feel. In the village, everything had its season, and Essex was no different. It came with the planting, when hands touched in furrows of wet earth, when sweat smelled like promise. It came with the harvest, when nights grew colder and bodies curled closer for warmth. There were times when it was forbidden not by law, but by rhythm. During Lent, on feast days, before a pilgrimage, the old women knew when not to lie together, just as they knew when to plant garlic or dry thyme. They whispered rules to their daughters, passing them like recipes. Never Essex on a waning moon. Always bathe before the wedding. Don't kiss with bread in your mouth. These weren't written. They lived in stories, in nods, in the slow shake of a head when a girl walked too freely. The body was a vessel, a field, a beast, a curse. It was everything and nothing. For most women, their first Essex came with confusion. Not because it was violent, though it could be, but because no one explained. They were told about duty, about being still, about closing their eyes and waiting. Some cried after. Some smiled because they thought they should. And some felt nothing at all. Men weren't taught either, not really. They watched animals, heard songs, traded rumors with older boys. They came to Essex with expectation, not understanding. They thought it was something to prove, a mountain to climb, a conquest to win. No one said that sometimes it was soft, or wordless, or trembling. And so they learned the hard way through failure, through silence, through nights when neither partner spoke after. In the countryside, talk of pleasure was rare, a luxury, something for nobles, not for those who spent days hunched over soil. But desire didn't care about station. It came anyway. In dreams, in the scent of someone passing, in the shape of a shoulder, the sound of a laugh. It was quiet but constant. A man sharpening tools would find himself thinking of his wife's back. A woman kneading dough would remember the boy who once fetched water beside her. These thoughts came and went like wind. Sometimes they stayed. Essex was often tangled with superstition. Herbs were burned to purify beds. Garlic hung above the cradle. A man who spilled seed alone was told his fields would fail. A woman who dreamed of Essex was made to confess, even if the dream had no face. The priest knew. He heard it all. From women who feared their thoughts. From men who feared their bodies. From girls who bled too soon. From boys who couldn't stop watching the blacksmith's son. He listened. Sometimes he forgave. Sometimes he punished. But always he reminded them that desire was dangerous, that Essex was fire, and fire must be kept in the hearth, not loosed into the barn. There were charms, amulets, spells muttered over cider, ways to increase fertility, ways to stop it. A woman might tie a red string around her thigh. A man might bury a coin beneath the bed. No one admitted it, but many tried. Because Essex wasn't just about feeling. It was about survival, about lineage. about proving one's place. And so, even when it hurt, even when it felt hollow, people returned to it, out of habit, out of fear, out of hope. In spring, when lambs were born, something shifted. The air grew thick with newness. Young people lingered longer by the well, songs changed, laughter returned. And SX bloomed again, tentatively. A hand reaching for another, a whisper beneath the eaves. These moments mattered, even if they led nowhere, because they reminded people that they were more than labor, more than obligation. They were alive. And sometimes, being alive meant wanting, even when wanting was forbidden. The woods held secrets. Lovers met where the trees bent low, where moss cushioned every step. There, away from the eyes of neighbors, SX could be something else. Not duty, not debt, but discovery. These meetings didn't always last. Sometimes they ended with tears, with silence, with shame. But for a moment, they offered something rare, choice. A girl might return with leaves in her hair and never speak of it. A boy might sit alone by the river, his face flushed, his heart unsure. And in these pauses, in these half-formed stories, SX revealed its other face, the one not carved by church or village or law. The one shaped by longing, by curiosity, by the quiet need to connect. Some people never touched another soul that way. They lived long, full lives without ever knowing SX in the body. But they knew it in the gaze, in the tremble of a voice, in the aching joy of holding a newborn, in the absence of fear when someone sat close. SX was not always touch. Sometimes it was the space between touches, the decision not to move, not to speak, just to feel. Villages didn't have words for all this. They had chores, seasons, saints. But inside every person was a landscape no rule could map, a hunger no fast could erase. And so, across generations, across candlelit nights and misty mornings, people kept searching for warmth, for recognition, for a reason to smile when no one watched. Night in the village came early and stayed long. Without torches or candles, the world disappeared in black. People moved by feel, not by sight. A footstep on packed earth, the creak of straw, the hush of fire turned to coals. In that darkness, SX was both closer and farther. For married couples, it was routine. A touch under the blanket, a breath against the shoulder, no words, no ceremony, just warmth before sleep. But even in these small rituals, feelings stirred. Sometimes affection, sometimes sorrow. A woman might lie still, thinking of her mother's voice. A man might listen to the wind, remembering the face of a girl he met once on the road. There was no space for fantasy in the daytime, but at night, in that silence, minds wandered. Some used prayer to still their thoughts. Others let them roam. The hearth cast flickering light across beams and faces. It caught the curve of a neck, the outline of a hand. SX lived in those shadows, quiet and unclaimed. Most didn't speak of it. They lacked the words, or feared them. Instead, they used gestures, a ladle handed gently, a garment men, dead without being asked. These were languages too, ones that said, "I see you, I am here." For many, that was enough. Not passion, not fire, but presence. And presence, in a world so full of absence, was precious. Not all beds were shared. Some spouses slept apart, not from anger, but distance. The kind that grows from time, from survival, from grief. A woman who lost 2 children might close herself off. A man who returned from war might wake screaming. Between them, a wall of silence. SX did not knock on that wall. It waited, or faded, or found new paths. In stories, in dreams, in the lonely task of combing one's hair before sleep. There were women who lived alone, widows, spinsters, quiet figures who knew herbs and weather and where to dig for onions in spring. Some were feared, others respected, all were watched. Their SX lived in questions. Did they remember? Did they mourn? Did they still feel? These questions whispered louder than answers, And so they remained alone, not untouched, but unseen. In winter, SX retreated. Fingers too cold to undress, hearts too weary, the nights too long. But even then, bodies leaned together, shared breath, shared space. Not always for desire, often for comfort, survival. Two people beneath one fur blanket, their backs touching, eyes closed. That too was a kind of SX, a kind that asked nothing and gave everything. In spring, desire returned with the mud. Messy, unexpected. A boy watching a girl tie her apron. A girl watching a man stack wood. The body remembered. Even when the mind refused. Even when the church scolded, the body knew. And sometimes it acted, not with intention, but instinct. There were stolen moments. A kiss behind the barn. A hand brushing another during chores. These were sacred in their own way. Fleeting, but bright. Like the first crocus after snow. They didn't always lead to more. Often, they led to nothing. But the memory lingered. A soft ache, a hidden smile. SX in the countryside was a cycle. Like the moon. It waxed, waned, disappeared, returned. It obeyed no calendar, only feeling. And feeling in a world ruled by rules was its own rebellion. Elders spoke of times when it was simpler, when a glance meant a promise, when a hand on the waist meant yes. But even then, there was doubt, regret, joy. Just less noise, less rush, more waiting. And in that waiting, more depth. For young people, SX was mystery. Tantalizing, frightening, they watched animals, heard jokes, tried to piece together a map from fragments. Some learned early, some late, all awkwardly. There were no guides, only mistakes, and memories. And sometimes, mercy. An older partner who paused, a friend who explained, a priest who forgave gently. These moments mattered. They shaped futures. In the stillness of the hut, a man might touch his wife's face, not from desire, from awe, that she was there, that she chose him, or stayed, or breathed. These touches too were SX, the kind that healed, not burned. Children were born, raised, watched. They learned from watching, from silence, from glances between parents, from stories told at firesides, wrapped in metaphor. No one said the words, but they understood. Because love, longing, ache, comfort, these live in tone, in gesture, in presence. And SX at its core is all of those. So they grew, became men and women, took spouses, repeated patterns, broke some, created others. And so the cycle continued, through drought and rain, war and peace, grief and grace. In every village, every field, every heart that dared to feel more than fear, more than duty, more than what was allowed. That is where SX truly lived. Behind monastery walls, time moved differently. Bells, not sun, marked the day. The clang at dawn, the mid-morning ring, the long echo at dusk. Each note a summons, each moment predefined. In this world of order, SX had no room, or so it seemed. But human longing doesn't vanish with vows. It hides, it adapts, it waits. Young men arrived at cloisters with shaved crowns and trembling hearts. Some came willingly, others were given. A fourth son, a poor farmer's child, a boy too quiet, too dreamy. Here they were taught discipline, silence, prayer. The body was not an enemy, they said, but it must be tamed. So they fasted, whipped their backs, slept on straw. And yet, in the dark of their cells, thoughts bloomed. The memory of a girl's voice, the curve of a shoulder glimpsed at the river, the warmth of a friend's palm during morning chores. These thoughts weren't sins until they lingered, until they stirred. And then, the guilt came, heavy, thick, unrelenting. Confession followed, a whisper behind the screen. I thought of her. I felt something. The priest listened. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he remained silent. Sometimes he gave penance so long it bled into weeks. But always, he reminded, temptation is a test. Win it, and you grow. Fail it, and you start again. The monks believed S3X could be channeled, transformed, into love, E for God, into service, into song. They sang until their voices cracked, copied texts until fingers cramped, dug gardens, raised chickens, scrubbed stone. They filled every hour. But still, night came. Still, dreams crept in. Still, bodies stirred beneath thin robes. No one spoke of it, not aloud, but glances lingered. Jokes formed and died on lips. And sometimes, late at night, someone wept into a blanket. In nunneries, silence was deeper. Women bound by vows and walls. Some had loved, some had fled love, some never knew its name. Here, they grew herbs, tended the sick, wrote in margins of illuminated texts. They were told they belonged to God, and many believed it. But belief doesn't erase the past, nor stop the heart from fluttering at the memory of a touch. They bathed together, dressed each other, brushed hair slowly, carefully. These acts were ordinary, but sometimes they trembled with more, a pause, a breath, a hand that lingered too long. And afterward, a prayer said more urgently. Some fell in love, quietly, hopelessly. A Sister Agnes who looked too often at Sister Eleanor. A Sister Marie who blushed when the traveling friar praised her voice. These loves were not consummated, not usually, but they lived in poems, in glances, in pressed flowers hidden inside prayer books. The church taught that the body was a vessel, but it also taught that vessels could overflow, that temptation entered through the senses. So windows were small, robes were thick, meals were plain. But even in that austerity, desire found cracks. It always does. Some monks left, unable to bear the tension. Others stayed and bore it as a cross. A few fell, were discovered, punished, sent away. But most simply endured, carried their longing like a stone in the shoe, felt it, hated it, needed it. In the cold chapel, candles flickered. One monk stared too long at another's hands. One nun prayed louder when her thoughts wandered. These were not evil souls, just human ones, hungry for warmth in a world of chill. Even the saints, in old stories, battled S3X. St. Anthony saw demons in the shape of women. St. Benedict rolled in thorn bushes to rid himself of lust. These tales weren't warnings, they were mirrors. Proof that even the holiest struggled and still found peace. There were secret writings, manuals for confessors, lists of sins so detailed they revealed more than they forbade. Some monks copied them, red ink underlining words like touch, glance, imagination. Not to learn, to understand. To name the feelings they could not speak. Naming gave power, even if only in silence. Some found peace, real peace, through time, through prayer. Through the slow dissolving of need, their S3X became something else. A tenderness toward all, a gentleness in speech, a joy in simple things. For them, the body no longer screamed, it whispered, and the whisper was enough. But most struggled. Not always, not every day, but often. And in that struggle, they found humility, found compassion, became softer, not harder. Holier, perhaps, because they knew the fire and chose to sit beside it, not in it. Outside the cloister, people imagined monks as statues, nuns as shadows. But inside, they were as alive as anyone, with memories, regrets, hopes. And sometimes in the garden at dusk, with the quiet breeze and the scent of lavender, they smiled. Not because they had conquered desire, but because, for one moment, they felt whole. There were nights when the quiet of the monastery was almost too loud. The absence of voices, of horses, of bells, left behind a hum inside the body, as if the walls themselves breathed in rhythm with the soul. In this silence, monks and nuns were supposed to find peace, but sometimes they found only themselves. And the self was not always clean. In the corner of a cold cell, a monk knelt on stone, whispering words of contrition, not because he had acted, but because he had thought, And in the Middle Ages, thoughts had weight. The church said they did. That to imagine was to almost commit. That to linger was to fall. And so the mind became both battlefield and judge. A flicker of a dream, a memory from youth, a sigh that curled into longing and guilt followed, sharp and immediate. Confession became rhythm. A weekly release, the same words, the same shame. Sometimes the same priest, whose own voice trembled with recognition. They all carried it, even those who never admitted. A shared burden, never spoken, always understood. Some wrote their sins on scraps of parchment and burned them, a ritual of vanishing. Others starved themselves, not for penance, but to numb the body, to silence it. But the body is patient, and SX is not just desire. It is memory, comfort, ache, tenderness. These don't die with fasting. They wait, in the fold of a robe, in the space between fingers, in the warmth of the sun through a stained glass window. Some believed they could redirect it, that longing could become divine, that the same energy H stirred at the sight of skin could be channeled into prayer, into compassion, into beauty. They painted icons with trembling hands. They tended gardens with reverence. They sang hymns with voices that cracked, and sometimes it worked. Sometimes the body quieted, the thoughts stilled, a brief, crystalline clarity. But more often, the longing simply changed shape, grew gentler, sadder, less urgent, but more persistent. Like a bell heard from a distance. Some wrote poems, not about people, about light, about rivers, about the way candle wax ran down brass in slow golden lines. These poems were filled with longing, but never named, never pointed, just felt, just shared. In the refectory, they sat in silence, eating slowly. Bread, beans, broth. Across the table, eyes met. Not often, not long, but enough. Enough to remind them they were not stone. That beneath the habit was a chest that rose and fell, a heart that beat, a skin that still remembered being touched. Some feared these reminders. Others cherished them, a sign they had not yet turned to dust. In confession, the same words returned again and again. I looked. I desired. I remembered. The priests heard them all. And sometimes they offered comfort, not through forgiveness, but through presence. A hand on the shoulder, a sigh that said, "Me too." Because even those who wore the stole were not immune. Some had lived lives before the robe. Some still did, in dreams. One nun once wrote in her journal, "I loved a boy before God, and now I love God like I loved him." No one ever read it, but it was there, folded between pages, pressed like a dried violet. Love and SX and worship were not separate things. They bled together, especially in the quiet, especially when no one watched, especially when the stars outside blinked like eyes. In the garden, nuns planted rosemary for remembrance, lavender for calm. Some knew which plants could quiet the womb. Others knew which could stir it. This knowledge was not spoken, but it passed, hand to hand, eye to eye. One nun slipped a sprig into another's pocket. No words, just the scent, just understanding. Some monks made pilgrimages to holy wells, to bones of saints, not always for redemption, sometimes to flee their own hearts, to walk away from a name they had thought too often, from a gaze they could not forget. They returned dusty, weary, but not always lighter, because you cannot walk away from yourself. The church offered guidance, but not clarity, and so each person became their own answer, their own exile, their own grace. In those final hours of night, just before matins, the air was thickest. Dreams not yet forgotten, dawn not yet born. It was then that many prayed hardest, not to be cleansed, but to be accepted, as they were. Bodies, minds, failures, desires. Some believed they had failed. Others believed they had simply been human, And between those two beliefs was a chasm only love could cross. Love for God, for self, for the one who once laughed by the river. SX in the cloister was not loud. It did not burn. It ached. It whispered. It stayed. Not to tempt, to remind that even in silence, we are never alone. In the final breaths of the Middle Ages, when the bells rang and cloisters swayed in the wind like stone lullabies, the question of SX was never resolved. It never needed to be. It remained a pulse beneath every vow, a ghost in every candlelit chapel, a truth too human to name and too sacred to forget. In monasteries that smelled of damp stone and ink, monks aged into silence. Their hands, once quick with prayer beads, grew slow and veined. And still, sometimes, as they sat beneath the worn wood of the refectory table, a memory would surface. Not scandalous, just warm. A smile, a song, a soft moment from a life half remembered. They did not flee from it. Not anymore. With age came gentleness. With years came peace. Some had wrestled with longing until their ribs ached. Others had turned that longing into beauty, copying psalms, tending vines, carving crucifixes whose faces bore more sorrow than wrath. They had not erased desire. They had woven it into everything. Into the rhythm of chants, into the sharpness of ink, into the pauses between words. The nuns, too, had grown older. Their hair grayed beneath their veils. Their hands remained steady as they prepared salves, ground herbs, stitched robes. They whispered prayers not out of fear, but from habit. And some, in quiet moments, wrote in margins of devotional texts, "I still dream of her," or "I feel less alone knowing she once looked at me." These weren't confessions, they were confirmations that something tender had lived within them, and still did. Sex in these places had never been about bodies colliding. It had been about nearness, about intimacy that resisted touch, about hunger that found expression in song, in gaze, in prayer. A nun kneeling in the dark might think not of sin, but of kindness. A monk lighting a candle might remember how a friend once held his hand too long and neither spoke. And in those thoughts, there was no shame, just recognition, just truth. The church did not always know what to do with such truths. Manuals were written, rules etched in Latin, lists of sins as long as psalters. But in practice, mercy often outweighed doctrine. Confessors listened more than they punished. And even when penance was harsh, it was not always cruel, because they too were human. They too had watched the candlelight flicker and felt something stir. In some places, older monks mentored younger ones with eyes not of judgment but of understanding. They spoke of vigilance, of discipline, but also of compassion. If your thoughts wander, one might say, gently guide them back, like a child returning home. And when that didn't work, they reminded, you are still loved. Love. It lingered behind everything. The word rarely spoken, but always present. Love for God. Yes, but also for one another, for the self, for the fleeting, aching beauty of being alive in a world that demanded restraint. Some monks wrote letters they never sent. Some nuns composed songs no one heard. These acts were SX in its purest, quietest form, reaching, remembering, revering. There were nights when a storm passed over the cloister and all the candles blew out. In that darkness, fear sometimes took hold, not of God, but of being forgotten, of having lived without touch, without laughter. And then a voice might sing, a hymn low and familiar, and one by one the others would join, not because it was required, but because it was needed. Connection, even if only through sound, even if only for a moment. In the morning, life resumed, chores, prayers, lessons, but something had shifted. A warmth, a knowing. In those final years, as the medieval world began to crack and change, the cloisters remained. Some closed, some endured, and in each, SX still lived, not in scandal, not in shame, but in the way a hand touched a shoulder, in the way bread was passed with care, in the way silence became more than absence, sight became presence, the presence of memory, of longing, of love that had no name but was known by all. And so, as we leave these halls, as we step out from stone and shadow, we carry with us not the rules, not the sins, but the humanity, the softness, the sacred ache that lived even in the holiest hearts. What was SX like in the Middle Ages? It was everything and nothing. It was feared and worshipped, hidden and honored, but most of all, it was human, and still is.